Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Thank Goddess podcast. It's Danny here, your host. I am coming to you with a solo cast today, and today's topic is going to be a pretty deep topic to explore. It's on finding empowerment after sexual abuse and trauma. And I just want to first give this disclaimer before we get into today's episode that this episode will perhaps contain some trigger-worthy content because I will be sharing some of my personal experiences with sexual abuse and trauma. And so if this is not the right time to listen to this episode, then feel free to turn it off. I just want to disclaim this because I know that this is a sensitive topic for a lot of people, but I also at the same time feel called to share my truth on this and what I'm really feeling from a higher spiritual level is that this message needs to be shared right now. And when I do share a lot of this, I am not looking for comfort or for people to feel sorry for me. I've done a lot of healing work on sexual abuse and trauma, and I feel really good about speaking about it, and I feel really called to speak about it, just in the hope of maybe me sharing my story might help others who have experienced similar things to feel that they're not alone. Because we're never alone in what we're experiencing, no matter how dark, no matter how painful it is, we're never alone. And so that is the hope, that is the heart of what I'm going to share in today's episode. So first off, I would like to start by talking a little bit about what is victim consciousness and what does it exactly mean to be a victim? Because we live in a world right now where it's really, I want to say cool, it's really popular, it's really encouraged to be a victim. And this episode is really about understanding why we don't want to identify as a victim ever in our lives. No matter how much we may have suffered from the most high perspective, you never want to identify as the victim. And I'm going to explain more about that throughout this episode. To truly understand victim consciousness, essentially what we're talking about here is believing that our power is outside of ourselves. To be a victim, it's to define ourselves by external experiences, or we know ourselves by something external that's happened to us. And essentially what we believe, even if it's not conscious to us, but when we adopt the mentality of the victim, of victim mentality, victim consciousness, is that we are at effect of the outside world. And essentially what we're doing by giving our power to something outside of us is, of course, we are left powerless. We are left disempowered because we have given our power away, regardless if it's conscious or not. We have given away our power to something outside of ourselves, to a circumstance, to a person, to a situation, whatever it may be. And essentially what we're saying is that this person, this situation, this circumstances has power over me. And that in itself is just so disempowering. I mentioned before that we live in a world that thrives on people remaining in victim consciousness, right? Because guess what? When we are disempowered, we are easily manipulated. Because we believe that we do not have the power within ourselves, we then look to others to provide the solution, to give us power, to retrieve our power. And you can imagine there are a lot of systems in our society that thrive on us thinking that our power is outside of us. Think about the beauty industry. Think about the health industry, the education industry, the government, the politics. There are so many things in this consumer-driven world that would like us to believe that this object, this person, this item, this product can have all the answers that will solve all of our problems, that will make us beautiful, make us healthy, make us feel more empowered, will give us more money, more self-esteem, more love, more whatever the thing. We can always be a victim of anything, really, if we adopt this mentality that we are somehow powerless. And we're seeing it more and more in the world. I mean, if you think about the word trigger, right, it's become really popular, I feel, to be triggered. Like, who can be more triggered? And more in society, we're having to be cautious about what we say, how we speak, our body language, our words, all of these things, because we don't want to offend people. We don't want to trigger people. And essentially, that mentality, like we have to kind of walk on eggshells around certain people so they don't get triggered, that is perpetuating this victim consciousness society, right? Because essentially what we're saying is that all of these people that are easily triggered are victims. They have given their power to something outside of themselves. They are at the effect of the outside world. You say the wrong word, you call someone the wrong pronoun, you, I don't know, somehow offend someone in some way, then all of a sudden they have a certain reaction and they are complete victims of the situation, right? Or so they believe. And that state in itself is not helpful at all. We don't want to be in that state, because essentially what we're saying is that we are these fragile, weak, powerless individuals. And that mentality, to think you're weak, to think you're powerless, to think you're fragile, first of all, it's not true. And second of all, it does not help you in any way, which shape or form that you might believe. You might think that it's serving you, that it's helpful, but I can guarantee you that you are not creating anything positive in your life from that mentality, from that mindset, from that frequency that you're adopting, that vibration that you're operating at. That will not attract anything empowering to you. It will do just quite the opposite. I'm going to give you a very tangible example of that, what happened to me in this episode. The problem that adopting this mentality of that I'm a victim, that I'm weak, that I'm powerless, is that not only are we just giving our power away, not only are we affirming disempowerment about ourselves, but we essentially start to believe, whether we're conscious of it or not, we start to believe that life is somehow our enemy, that we are the victims to life, that life is bad, that bad things always happen to me, that life is not our friend, that perhaps God is not our friend, that the universe is not our friend, whatever word you want to use. We start to adopt this mentality that like we're alone, that we have to somehow defend ourselves, that we can't rely on anyone or anything because we're constantly under attack. That's what's happening at this more subconscious level when we adopt this mentality. And that couldn't be any further away from the truth, because truly we are all so divinely guided and blessed and loved from the divine, and we have so much support, and nothing in life is out to get us. No matter how much you have suffered, no matter how much pain has been inflicted upon you in your life, no one is out there trying to get you. I guarantee you that. And the beautiful thing about coming outside of victim consciousness, of moving more towards empowerment is that you can see the higher perspective of the things that you may have suffered in your life. And once you apply that higher perspective to that thing, to that situation, to that person, to that circumstance, it is so liberating on the other side to release that heaviness of what you're holding on to. Because you might not realize how heavy it is what you're holding when you hold on to victim consciousness, when you hold on to a story. But essentially when we stay in victim consciousness, we are just recycling the past. We are revisiting a situation, a time in our lives, a person, something that happened. We just keep recycling it and revisiting it. The issue is we can get stuck there. We can get stuck in the past, and it inhabits us from moving on with our lives, from being free, from creating something new. And often if we get stuck in the stories of our past, if we can't move past them and we keep regurgitating them in different ways and we hold on to that energy, even though it may have been really painful and hard, if we hold on to that, we can create from that space, regardless if we want to or not, and we can start to see the same patterns unfolding again and again and again in our life. Even if we don't want that same situation to occur again, guess what? It can. If we do not heal from what we've been through, if we don't integrate the lessons, if we don't come out on the other side and start moving forward and choosing a different way to see what has happened. This victim consciousness, as attractive as it might seem, as good as it might feel, this is a game for our egos. You know, the ego is the part of us that believes in separation. It believes in this physical human construct. It's the separation essentially from God, the divine, the universe. And victim consciousness is a game of the ego. And anything that comes out of our ego is never life-giving. In fact, it wants to destroy life. And we will never find solutions here. We will never receive healing here. We will never move forward from living in our past pains and sufferings and hurts and traumas and whatnot. We have to become present to the present moment in order to receive that divine wisdom, the healing that takes place, in order to receive the solutions of how to move forward. And that doesn't happen from recycling the story and staying in that vibration of victimhood. So now I want to talk a little bit about the victim triangle. You might have heard of this before, and I think it's a really useful way to understand victim consciousness. So within the victim triangle, there are 3 different roles or 3 different identities that take place. You have the rescuer or the hero, you have the victim, and then you have the victimizer. And so in order for there to be a victim triangle, we need all 3 of these roles. And it doesn't necessarily have to be people that play out these roles. We can, within our own psyches, play out this victim triangle within our own mind. So we can be the victim, the victimizer, and the rescuer all in one, right? And this can happen a lot in relationships. This happens a lot in organizations and politics and government systems. This happens, once you understand it, you can see it played out in so many different areas of the world at large and within yourself. What we want to understand is that the victim triangle is not a place that you want to live. And the way to get out of the victim triangle is, first of all, to be aware that you're in the triangle. Once we're aware that we're in this triangle, then we can move outside of it. Okay, so awareness is key. So let's talk a little bit about the different roles in this triangle. So we've spoken a bit about the victim, so we understand what a victim is. The victim is someone who believes that their power exists outside of them. Then, of course, you have to have a victimizer. In order for there to be a victim, the victim has to be at loss to something outside of itself. So it could be a person is the victimizer, the perpetrator. It could be a situation. It could be a bill, for example, like you get a fine or a bill in the mail, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this thing is happening to me. How am I going to pay my bills? So it could even be something like that. We could be a victim to the weather. Oh, it's so hot today. The sun is so strong and I got sunburn. I'm a victim of the sun. So it can play out in, I know that's kind of a silly example, but it can play out in so many different ways. This is a mindset. This is a consciousness, and how we do one thing is how we do everything. The other part of it, which I think a lot of people sometimes get confused about how it plays into the victim triangle, is the rescuer or the hero, so to speak. And I think sometimes people can look at the hero and think, well, it's good to help people. I want to help people that are stuck in victimhood or feeling that they've lost their power, right? So there's nothing wrong with helping people, but there's a healthy way to help people and there's an unhealthy way to help people. And the unhealthy way is what shows up in the victim triangle, because there are some people out there, and I explained before about how we live in this victim consciousness world, society, right? Like the world thrives on victim consciousness. So you could say, for example, that a health product or a drug could be the rescuer. So people that are sick could be the victim. The victimizer is the illness that they have gotten. And then the hero or the rescuer is this drug, this health product that will solve all your problems and will heal you. Okay? And the reason why it shows up in the victim triangle is because if the hero or the rescuer believes that it has the power to heal or rescue the victim, then it is affirming the victim consciousness within the victim. Okay? Because let me tell you, a true healer, someone who truly wants to help people, whether that be a coach or a teacher, someone who truly wants to help will never want to disempower the person that they are helping. They will always want to help that person recognize the power within themselves. All of us are so powerful. If only we all knew how much power resides in us, that we are all created in the image and likeness of God, that our power doesn't exist anywhere outside of us. And if anyone is telling you that they have the answers to whatever it is that you're seeking, be very wary about that. That's what I'll say about that, because there's nothing wrong with having mentors and coaches and teachers and healers and having aides and rescuers, so to speak. I wouldn't call it rescuer, but to helpers. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Because certain teachers and healers and good doctors can assist us in our healing or awaken things within us that are maybe dormant, right? But they will never make you feel like they are the solution to all their problems. Their purpose will be to help you to step into your power, maybe even to get you on the healing path, but they know that the body can heal itself, essentially. So they're just trying to realign what maybe is in misalignment, if that makes sense. But they're not saying, I have all the answers, I'm the healer, I'm the special one, and you need me in order to access your gifts or your health or whatever the thing. So I hope that makes sense. That's where the unhealthy rescuer kind of gets thrown in the mix. So we never want to feel, ideally, that our power exists outside of us, because it doesn't. All the sages, all the gurus will tell you that everything you seek is within you. And it is so true. Those that walk the spiritual path, and probably if you're listening to this podcast, you are on a spiritual path, you'll know that is ultimately the truth of all that there is, that we have the whole universe within us. and we have all the answers, all the resources within our own temple. And yes, of course, other people can help you awaken that, but they will never tell you that you don't have it within yourself as well. So I think that's enough about the victim triangle. I did mention that to get out of the victim triangle, we need to first have awareness that we're actually in the victim triangle. So there's good news, we can get out of it. And the answer to getting out of the victim triangle is empowerment. Really, to say, hey, I don't want to be a victim anymore. I choose something different. I choose to be a non-victim of my reality. I choose to see my life from a different perspective, from a higher perspective. And just choosing that, setting that intention is so powerful. All the angels and all your guides will be celebrating as you set that intention for yourself. Trust me, they're like, yes, 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 yes. They're all supporting you. And why are they supporting you? So I want to talk a little bit about David Hawkins. You might have heard of this book called Power vs. Force. I highly recommend any of his work, but this book's really great. And it basically explains how anyone... Okay, back up. So David Hawkins, he's basically created this thing called the map of consciousness. You might have seen it. It's basically a scale from 0 to 1,000 where he has basically created this scale towards like a pathway to enlightenment. So 1,000 being enlightenment. And so he talks about Jesus being at the level of 1,000, which is enlightenment essentially. And there's certain numbers along the scale, and it talks about basically where your frequency level is. And from that level or that frequency that you're operating at, that's kind of your point of attraction. So you are embodying that frequency and attracting from that frequency. And David Hawkins, he speaks about anything under 200 being essentially victim consciousness. So he speaks about the level 200 being the level of courage, being the level of empowerment. So essentially where we want to get to on his map of consciousness is 200 and above. Okay, because once we start getting out of victim consciousness and we start stepping on that scale from 200 and above, that's when we can start creating more positive changes in our lives rather than getting stuck in those patterns and loops from, you know, the pain and suffering of our past, staying in that victim consciousness. I'm at effect of the outside world. Poor me, things are happening to me, you know, I'm a victim of life. All of these stories, all of these narratives, they can keep us stuck. They can keep us at these lower levels, as David Hawkins speaks about. And if you're listening to this episode and you're still listening, I assume that means that there's part of you, whether you're conscious of it or not, that wants to step into empowerment, wants to step onto that level of 200 and above. So David Hawkins speaks about how in his book Power vs. Force that 85% of the human race, at the point when he wrote that book, it's probably changed since then, but he speaks about how 85% is actually collaborating below the critical level of 200, which means that 85% roundabout of humanity is operating at victim consciousness. So that's staggering, right? That's a lot of people operating in victimhood and not knowing the power that they have within them, which makes a lot of sense in the world that we see at large, how much, you know, corruption there is, how much consumerism and this whole top-down hierarchy that we see in the world today. A lot of that has to do with people not knowing that the power exists within them. So David Hawkins speaks on the topic of power, and he says that power is total and complete within itself and requires nothing from outside of itself. And he speaks about how power, true power, is self-sustaining, right? Because it knows that its power comes from within. It doesn't come from without. And I think a beautiful example of true power is Mother Nature, right? Because Mother Nature is self-sustaining. She's not going out and exerting herself, trying to make ends meet at the end of the month. Like, she knows that she will be fine. She knows that she's going to receive all the resources that she needs to receive, and she gives so freely of herself. And that is what true power is about, knowing who your true source is, knowing that your power lies within you. Whereas force, on the other hand, which is below the level of 200, as David Hawkins speaks about, is thinking that your power exists outside of you. And a lot of people will look at the government and think that the government is in power, right? But if you think about it, the government isn't self-sustaining. The government relies on all its citizens to be in power, quote unquote. And if all the citizens decided to rebel against the government, and citizens were like, yeah, we're not going to listen to the government, we're not going to pay our tax, whatever the thing, the government would have absolutely no power. It's completely relying on the power of the citizens in order for it to gain power. So you see, that's the difference between true power and a misconception of power, which David Hawkins calls force. So I highly recommend his book if you haven't read it. It's really, really, really interesting, and it goes deeper into this conversation. So now I want to talk about empowerment, okay? Because this is such a huge message that I really want to share in this episode, and it's why I've even created this episode. And this is everything that, after my whole life experience, that's led me up to now, all the things that I've been through. And I want to share my story in just a minute. This is ultimately the higher truth that I've come to know from everything that I have experienced, all the trauma, all the atrocities that happened in my life. The key takeaway for me has been to step into empowerment. And since doing so, my life has radically changed for the better. And that is why I want to preach this message as far and wide as possible, because I tell you what, like, just from my personal experience, there is nothing more transformational. If you want to seek a better relationship, a better career, better finances, better self-esteem, whatever the thing, better health, knowing where your power lies and truly allowing yourself to surrender even to higher powers, that has been for me the key, the true key to liberation and to radical transformation of my life for the better. And so empowerment, and I kind of alluded to this before, is really defining yourself by your internal truth. It's about knowing who you are. I know who I am, what I am, and nothing can shake me. No thing outside of me, no situation, no person, no circumstance can ever take me away from my power, my truth. You think of these people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. They knew who they were, and they never let fear get in the way of that. They stood up for what they believed. Jesus, think about Jesus being crucified. He forgave those that were crucifying him while he was on the cross. He never got down on his knees and said, please, please, please don't kill me, please. No, he stood in his truth for what he believed in, of his connection to the divine. He never backed down from anything. And I think there's so much wisdom that can be shared from that for all of us to stand in our truth. Joan of Arc, another person that's coming to mind. She was burnt after doing so much for France, and she was accused of being a witch because she had a divine connection with God, and she was killed for that. And she never once let that deter her from her connection with the divine. And there's so many stories like this, and they send chills up my spine, even just speaking their names. I feel their power. It's so strong. Even today, after many, many centuries, their stories, their will, that will to never back down for what is true, still holds so much resonance today. And I think, there's so much we can take away from those stories. And we can feel empowered within ourselves no matter what we experience in our lives. And by doing so, we are choosing to create better for ourselves. No matter what we have experienced in our past, we are saying, you know what? That doesn't define me. That doesn't define who I am. I'm not going to let that story run the rest of my life. I'm not going to be a victim to this story, this situation, this person. There is so much power in choosing something different for yourself. And I'm telling you, you are so supported by so many beings that you cannot see. Your higher self even clapping, your ancestors clapping, your angels clapping, cheering you on. Yes, 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 this is the truth. This is the truth of who you are, and it is time to remember. And now I want to share my story with you around sexual abuse and trauma, so that, as I mentioned in the beginning, that maybe it can inspire you to look at things that you may have suffered from in the past, and to not see yourself as a victim, because I certainly, at this point in my life, I do not identify as a victim, and I don't see myself as a victim of anything that I experienced in my life. And I say that sincerely after going through a lot of healing, and I don't want to be seen as a victim at all. I do not want anything to do with victimhood, even though some people might classify me as a victim, quote unquote. So when I was in my early 20s, I suppose the first thing that really shook me a lot was I got a part-time job, as most of us do. I worked in a supermarket, and I worked with a older gentleman, and one day we were working, just the two of us together, and he basically said a lot of things to me, very inappropriate for a workplace or any kind of situation anyway. Basically saying that he wanted to have sex with me, that he wanted to have a threesome. You can imagine. I won't get into all the details, but basically it was a lot. And I remember that I went into a freeze response at the time. I didn't even really understand sexual harassment at that point in my life. I think I was about 20 years old. You never think at that point especially that you would ever be that person that gets sexually harassed. You hear about it in like those workshops that we take in our workplaces, but you never think like you'll be that girl or man, right? And it happened to me. I was sexually harassed, and I went into a freeze response. And what I now understand from that experience is there was a lot of guilt and shame that I adopted from that experience, and I was involved in this huge sexual harassment case. Basically, the guy got fired, but he took out a lawsuit against me and the company and said that I lied, and it became this 6-month law case where I was speaking to lawyers. It was very traumatic. I had to relive everything. He basically denied everything that I had said in my statement, and basically said I was the one coming on to him, so completely twisted the story. I won't get into all the details, but that in itself was very traumatic, just in the sense that as a young girl, I didn't understand how trauma worked, and I didn't understand, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And I know that I had a freeze response in that moment, but I couldn't understand why. I didn't even know why that happened, or that was even a trauma response. I remember in my head was telling me, get out of the situation, get out of the situation, as this man was saying all of these things to me that made me feel so uncomfortable. I couldn't move my body. I was like a statue. I just stood there and I was just receiving everything that he said. And my head was like, move, go. And I couldn't move. And I just stood there. And for so long, I felt so guilty about not doing anything, about not moving. I beat myself up about, why did I just stand there? People found out about it and they said, oh, why didn't you just tell him to F off? And I felt guilty about that. I felt shame about that because I didn't. I just stood there like a mute. And it's only, as I got older, probably closer towards 30, that I started learning about trauma and understanding what actually unfolded that day. Not long after that, a couple years after that, I was out with my girlfriends. I was 23, drinking alcohol at a nightclub in Melbourne, and my drink was spiked. And this man, unknown to me, somehow that night was very much a blur because my drink was spiked, and I've never experienced anything like that before. I never took drugs before in my life, and it was a really surreal experience because I don't remember so much of what happened, but I do know that I was taken to a man's home and I was raped that night. I basically passed out, and thankfully, I wasn't hurt physically. My friends were able to find me. I must have had angels with me that night because I was safe in a way. But what happened afterwards was very, very traumatic. First of all, the recognition that I had been raped was really difficult to grapple with, because again, you think that had never happened to me. Like, I'd never be that girl, right? And again, there was this huge guilt and shame that took over. I felt so ashamed of myself. I didn't want anyone to know what had happened. I went to a hospital because I was afraid that maybe I would get an STD, or what if I was pregnant. No one tells you what to do after you've been raped or assaulted. I certainly didn't know at 23 years old. I had no clue. I was just afraid. I just remember feeling shame and fear. And I went to a hospital, and the hospital ended up calling the police. Once I told them that I had been raped, I had to get tests, very intrusive tests that night. I had someone from a rape support service or something along those lines come, and she basically told me, she discouraged me from reporting the rape because she said most rapes do not have a positive outcome. I felt at that time like I did have to pursue a case against what happened, so I did file a report of sexual assault, and there was an investigation, and that in itself was very, very traumatic. It was a similar theme with the sexual harassment and the rape. Both times during the investigation, it felt like I was defending my innocence. From my experience of all of this, we live in this world where first of all, rape is something we as a collective don't want to look at, and it happens a lot more than people know. It is so much more common than people think, and in order for us to truly heal sexual violence and rape, we need to actually look at it. We need to acknowledge that it happens. And the problem is that, and I'm not saying every person has to come out about it, but a lot of the time, because it's a very complicated trauma, because a lot of the time the person who's being assaulted feels so much shame and guilt within themselves, they blame themselves for what happened, because culturally we do tend to blame the victim because we don't want to acknowledge that this thing actually exists within the human consciousness, that people are capable of raping. we tend to try to find excuses. Oh, there must be a reason why this person got raped. What were they wearing? What were they doing? Oh, were they drinking? Were they under the influence of drugs? We try to, with our logical, rational mind, try to justify it in some way. And we don't do this intentionally. It often comes from this place of just fearing that darkness. We don't want to acknowledge that this happens. And because so many people that are assaulted feel this deep shame within themselves, feel that there's something wrong with them, they don't come forward about it. They don't report it. They don't tell anyone about it. They keep it to themselves. And because of that, it goes unknown. It becomes this thing that is there, but we don't look at it. We don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it. And it's just getting worse. The police officer said to me, and this was, over 10 years ago when I was raped, when I was 23, she said that this happens every night in Melbourne, that a woman is raped every night in Melbourne. That's what she said to me. She was very blasé about it, like, well, what do you want us to do? This happens every day. And that's the kind of world that we're living in right now. And that's why I feel really called to talk about this on this podcast and to share with you, because I know that I'm not alone. I know that the more I've started coming out about my story, the more women that come to me and say, me too. And it's not just women, but majority of sexual assault, rape cases, sexual violence is happening to women. Nearly 1 in 3 women globally has been subjected to at least once to physical or sexual violence, or both. And then what happened a few years after the rape incident, I moved overseas and I appeared to change my life. I became a flight attendant. I lived in the Middle East for many years, and I felt at that time that I had buried a lot of what happened. Now, in hindsight, I can see that I was still carrying all the shame and the trauma. I never told people what had happened to me. I didn't tell people about all this, the sexual harassment and the rape. I didn't tell people that. I kept it hidden. And a few years after that, I think I was about 27 maybe, or 28, I was raped a second time. So I went on a layover. This was when I was living overseas, and I had a trip to France, and I was so excited, and I was flying with someone who I considered a friend. I had flown with this man a few times before, and I was really excited to go out with him on the layover. So we made plans, we went out, we had a few wines, I got a bit drunk, and what ended up happening is he walked me back to my room. I was not in a functional state at all. I recall I was vomiting, and walked me back to the room. He came into my room, and I was basically passed out on my bed, and all I know is that the next thing he was on top of me, and you can imagine what happened. And the worst part about this attack was that the first time I was under the influence of drugs, my drink had been spiked, so I didn't really know what was happening. I didn't really recall it. But this time I was drunk, but I was conscious. Like, I couldn't see what was happening, but I didn't have the physical strength to prevent it from happening. This man was a lot larger than me, and I couldn't, especially in the state that I was in, I didn't have the strength to fight him. And so I just remember turning my head and pretending that I wasn't in my body. And again, this comes down to a trauma response. I had a fawning response where, and this happens a lot to people who experience sexual assault, when you're not able to fight or flight, maybe the perpetrator is bigger than you, or you don't feel that you can get away from the situation or fight what's happening to you, you can freeze or fawn, as in to kind of go along with what's happening, so in the hope that you don't get hurt more than what's already happening to you, so that you can kind of get out safely of the situation. And so, it's not easy for me to share all of this, and I could talk about more things, but I think that's enough to kind of leave you with. What I want to say is that these type of things are really normal. I know I'm not alone. And I feel, because I've done so much healing work on this, there was a long period of time I could not talk about what happened to me without crying. I would be triggered every time someone said the word rape. I just felt so much shame and guilt within me. And I honestly believe, and I know this might trigger some people, but I honestly believe, now that I can see things from a higher perspective, that not consciously, I attracted that second rate to me. Not intentionally. No one would ever want to attract sexual violence or trauma towards them. Of course, I would never want that to happen to myself. But because I was operating at that frequency of shame, which David Hawkins explains is like one of the lowest frequencies to experience, right? It's victim consciousness. Because I was operating from victim consciousness, I was reliving the story. I hadn't healed it. I hadn't truly separated from the story. I was still a victim. Even though it wasn't at the forefront of my mind, it was still there, because I was so easily triggered by what happened. I wasn't able to speak about it. It had this hold over me. It had this deep grip over me. I couldn't move past the story. I felt damaged. I felt like I'd been used. I was somehow wrong or bad. If anyone found out this about me, that I would somehow be unlovable, that people would judge me, that I'm somehow ruined. And because I had that deep belief in my subconscious for so many years, I kept attracting situations to me of that same low density vibration. And I know that can be really triggering for a lot of people to hear, but in my experience, seeing it from that higher perspective, seeing it as I was essentially choosing this to happen by not raising my frequency, by not choosing to step into empowerment. As long as I'm a victim to my external reality and these things, these external forces, I cannot create the world that I want to live in. I cannot step into empowerment. I cannot step into higher states of feeling good. I can't, because I'm always going to be effect of something outside of me. I'm always going to be disempowered. And guess what? If that's what you believe at your core, life's just going to keep affirming that to you. That's how it works. That's the nature of the beast that we live in. That's how cause and effect works. We are the cause of our reality. And if we believe that we have no power, well, life's going to keep showing us how disempowered we are if we truly believe that at our core. And that is why it is so important. This is why I want to share this message, because it is so important to step into empowerment, to see that you are not a victim. You don't want to be a victim. You don't want to be this weak, fragile, disempowered being that gives all of its power away to external forces. Yeah, these things happened to me. Yeah, I was raped multiple times. I was sexually harassed. But that is not my story. That is not who I am at my core. At the truth of who I am, that is not who I am. I don't need to identify with these things that happen to me. I can choose to see it from a different perspective. And that choice in seeing it from a different perspective is so freaking empowering. It's so liberating. It's so freeing. And you know what? It has created a completely different reality for myself. I feel lighter. I feel so much more free, so much more love. And I don't attract these shitty people into my life anymore. I don't. Because I changed. The world didn't change. If you're waiting for the world to change, you're going to be waiting a long time. I changed and my world changed. The people in my world changed, the situations in my world changed, the circumstances in my world changed because of me, because I chose to see things from a different perspective. I chose to step into non-victim consciousness, into empowerment. And that is my invitation to all of you listening to this today. And the final thing that I want to share with you all is that because I feel so empowered by sharing this story, and I'm feeling really called to offer this different perspective to all of you listening, I've created a new program which came about very unexpectedly, but it feels so true, and it's called Warrior Goddess. It's a new program, a six-week program that I've created, and I want to take people in this container from victim to non-victim, victim to empowerment. And it's a container for people that have experienced things like me. If you've experienced sexual harassment, sexual trauma of any kind, sexual assault, rape, if you are in that story and you don't know how to move past it, I've created this beautiful container for all of us to walk through to empowerment together. And so it's going to be 6 weeks of once a week live calls. I'm offering it at a really, really low price to begin with. It's only 111 Australian dollars, and it's starting on the 27th of June. All the calls will be recorded, and I will be sending the replays to everyone in the container. Only $111. Why am I doing it so cheap? Because first of all, I want to offer this to as many people as possible. And secondly, because it's a new program, I've just created it. I really am looking to, obviously I want to deliver the best possible information to all of you, but because it is my first time, I'm really looking for feedback to how it's landing, what works, what doesn't work. And so in offering that lower price, I'm hoping that I can receive that feedback from you who are a part of this journey with me. So it's a little bit of a co-creation. There's a lot of stuff out there for people that have survived sexual assault and sexual trauma, and the thing is, a lot of people that are offering those programs and that healing haven't actually been through the sexual assault themselves. And so I'm not saying that they can't do this work and to heal, but I think the unique perspective in what I'm offering here is that I've walked this path. I've literally been in the situation, understanding the complexities of the trauma of rape and sexual harassment and sexual trauma and sexual abuse. Like, I get it, like I walked it, and I felt the shame and I felt the pain of it, and it can make you feel so isolated and alone, like no one will ever understand you. Like, if people knew this about me, then I would be immediately ostracized, I would be judged, or others will shame me. It creates like a lack of self-worth, and you know, not knowing how to return to the person you were before the assault. It can really just suck the life out of you, is what I found. It can leave you feeling angry at the justice system and not feeling supported by support workers, you know, because my experience, it was really hard to prosecute a rapist. Essentially, it's like impossible. That's what I found, and that's why the second time I was raped, I didn't even report it, because I had such a bad experience after the lawsuit that I went through and the police investigation. I've had such traumatic experiences, I didn't even want to put myself through it a third time. And going through these things, it can make you feel really afraid of the world and not wanting to interact with it, wanting to withdraw. It can also leave you like just replaying the trauma that happened in your mind and feeling stuck in the emotions and not being able to move past the story. I get it. Like, I've been in all of these situations. Like, I've lived this. I've lived this for so much of my life, And now that I wouldn't say I'm like fully healed from everything, but I'm on the path, and I've come to the other side where I've distanced myself from what happened, and I can finally feel free enough to talk about it and to lead other people through this journey, and helping you to release stuck energy in the body through embodiment work, through integrating spiritual healing and different modalities to help move out of the story, to help move to a higher perspective of what happened. Because I truly believe only when we adopt that higher perspective can we truly separate from the incident, and we don't have to wear the trauma like almost like a badge of honor. Like we can finally put it to the side, and we can see it from this distance, and that distance is so healing because you stop identifying with it. You stop identifying with the trauma, with the shame. That's the thing we want to disengage from, the shame, the identity of shame. Because what a lot of people don't understand is that it's one thing to feel guilty, because guilty means like, oh, I did something bad, maybe I stole something from someone, or I hurt someone's feelings and I feel bad about it. But shame is very different from guilt, because shame can become an identity, like it did for me. It became who I am. I am this bad person because I have been sexually violated, and it's like a dark secret that you don't want people to know. And that is so disempowering, and it will stop you, it will block you from manifesting anything positive in your life. It will really be this block in the way from everything that you truly want in your life. All the miracles that unfold and that can unfold and that you are deserving of. Of course, we all deserve to be happy. That is God's will for us. And that shame, oh my gosh, it is such a huge barrier to that perfect happiness that we are entitled to. So if this message is landing with you, if this episode is landing with you, then first of all, my heart is extending out towards you. I am with you. Know that first and foremost, I am with you. I know how painful sexual trauma is and can be, and I feel your suffering. I feel the pain, and know that you are not alone in this, and know that you can get through it. You can, and you will get through it. And so if you want to work with me, like I mentioned, Warrior Goddess is starting on the 27th of June. If that is calling to you, it's only $111. It's absolutely a bargain, and it's an online container, so it doesn't matter where in the world you are. I'm going to provide the link in the descriptions below. You can sign up, and I would be so grateful and excited to welcome you there. It's going to be a very transformational journey, and I'm feeling really supported by higher angelic beings that are supporting all of those who choose to sign up through this journey together. So that's all I wanted to leave you with today. It's a bit of a long episode, I know, but it's an important one. It's super important, this topic. And if you've stayed with me throughout the whole thing, congratulations, and know that you are on the path to empowerment, which is amazing, because you know what? When we end victimhood within ourselves, we end it within the world. And that's how we're going to make this world a better place. That's how we're going to heal the world at large, is when we can start looking at our own shadows and healing them within ourselves, and choosing empowerment, choosing to see things from a divine perspective and integrating that into our everyday lives. So thank you once again for being here, and I'll see you in my next episode. Mwah!